Dang it. You've got to be kind. Anybody that knows Kurt Vonnegut knows that I cleaned that quote up a little bit. One way that we can be kind in estate planning is through charitable giving. And that, my friend, is what we're going to talk about today on the Retirement Answer Man Show. Welcome to the show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. And this is the show dedicated, pretty obsessed, seriously, with helping you not just survive retirement, but rock retirement and make it the best stage of your life through intentional decision-making. And this entire month, we're focused on estate planning in retirement. And last week, we talked about giving to family. And this week, we're going to talk about giving to charity, helping society with volunteerism, but also with funds. Now, as a preview, next month is a really big topic. It's on how to make better decisions in retirement. When you enter retirement, you got a lot of decisions to make. What am I going to do all day long? How am I going to create a paycheck? How do I invest my assets? On and on and on. Who am I going to hang out with? So we're going to go through building a framework for better decision-making. We have two amazing guests, both New York Times bestsellers on decision-making and helping people make decisions. So I'm really excited about that for August. So tell all your friends. Now let's get going on discussing how do we give to charity right after a word from our sponsor. So the Rock Retirement Club is an online community where we have a safe place for people with the same spirit and in the same season of life, transitioning and living in retirement, where we can walk with the wise and become wise and receive world-class retirement education without any sales pitches. And it's a safe place. We had an email from someone looking to join the club asking, is it on Facebook? Because there are a lot of Facebook groups, private and open, and it is not. We chose to use a platform that is structured to be private and not indexed by Google. So it's a place that you don't normally go, but it's a safe place where we can have discussions together without the world being around or having to go to a place where everything is out there. And we have a code of conduct to make sure it's a safe place focused on intentional decision-making and helping each other. So if you're interested in something like that, go to rockretirementclub.com. Now let's go define this word charity.
Huh? What does that mean?
Charity. The voluntary giving of help, typically in the form of money, to those in need. As a country, as citizens, our citizenship, U.S. citizens, however you say that, are extremely charitable, have been for centuries. You and I do things individually, no doubt, to help individuals, to help give them a hand up. The difference with a charity is it's able to marshal and organize human capital, volunteerism, people doing things, and money to have a larger impact than one individually. And we think of the battle against cancer, or when a natural disaster happens, a hurricane or flood. It's amazing the amount of volunteerism we see and the amount of charitable donations we see to organizations that marshal to really help our fellow humans. Those natural disasters are huge, but there's this undercurrent of little tiny disasters happening every day, whether it's people losing their job and trying to figure out their next stage in life, having major medical expenses and losing their home. There's these ongoing little things that happen every day that don't make the headlines often, that are just as important. And in retirement, we have ability to speak into those people's lives and improve our entire community. So that's what charity is to me. Now, in our main segment, let's talk about some of the motivations and some ideas of how you might be able to do this in your life. I remember the first charity I gave money to. I was in my 20s. It was the first one I volunteered for as well, because I never really grew up with that mentality at all. I lived in Flower Mound, Texas, and I think it was Christian Community Action in Lewisville, Texas. And the thing that I liked about them was that they had the approach of teaching someone to fish. So what they did is they helped people that were either homeless or just down on their luck because of life happening. And they had an inventory of clothes. They taught them how to interview. They taught them life skills to help them move up and become independent again and get back on their feet. And right as I moved away from the area, they actually had built 5 or 6 houses, very small, where they could provide a place to live. But the whole point of the organization was to move people on to being independent. And that resonated with me from a volunteerism and from a money perspective. Each of us is going to have something that motivates us. Last year, I rode in the Pelotonia, a major bike ride in Columbus, Ohio, which is a crazy place for me to go because we have a member in the Rock Retirement Club that is a longtime participant and organizes a huge team for it. And I gave money and I went and rode because it was battling cancer. And it's hard to find anybody that hasn't been impacted by that. I lost my mother and my sister to cancer, so that was my motivation. So I think we start with charitable giving is, what is your motivation? Personally, there's supporting causes you're passionate about, something that either happened to you or someone that you're related to, or just something that moves you. I think that's one motivation. We have to search that out to figure out, we don't want to just give money flippantly. We want to be good stewards of it. I think another personal motivation is modeling being a good citizen. When my children were younger, and we did it a few times, so I'm not like I'm great at this. We went and helped volunteer at a school to build a playground. Modeling being a good citizen, whether it's for your children or for just the society in general. And then giving back for all the amazing things that we were able to create in our life. Now, what are some practical motivations? Well, one could be you're overfunded and you realize you're going to die with a lot of money, and maybe you don't have children, or maybe you don't want to give it to your children. That's a practical motivation. Tax deductions. The tax code is structured in such a way that encourages you to donate money, and we'll talk a little bit about that. A learning opportunity to teach someone the art of giving, that modeling. Memory creation. Going to that playground with my children, that was giving to the community, but a lot of my motivation was practical. I wanted my children, that modeling, I wanted my children to have that mindset of helping others. So if you're going to consider giving to charity, I think first explore, well, what moves you? What are your motivations? And then starting your search to find organizations that match what you want to have happen, what change you want to try to help create in the world for the better. Because there are a lot of charitable organizations I personally don't agree with. I wouldn't want to give money to. I don't agree with their mission. So we want to make sure we find charities that we agree with their mission. And then another component is we want to make sure that the charity that we're giving to is a good steward of the money they're receiving. Probably 3 things to look at are, number 1, is their charitable commitment. Is looking at, okay, I'm looking at this organization. How much of my dollar actually goes to helping people? Because a charity is going to have operation. They're going to have management. They're going to have fundraising expenses, overhead. And on average, about 85 cents of every dollar goes to the actual work of the charitable mission. And so we want to make sure we look at that, because there are many organizations that are fundraising significantly, but most of the money is going to more fundraising and overhead and salaries and everything else rather than the actual mission. And so we want to make sure we're good stewards for that. And we'll try to have a link to a few articles to help you determine that. That's not really what I wanted to dive into today, but it's important. So let's talk about some possible vehicles you could use to give to charity while you're alive. And again, this is from the umbrella of estate planning and how do we do this effectively. And hopefully this will give you some ideas. So while you're alive, there are a few things that you can do. And we'll start with some of the easier ones and then go down to a little bit more complex. The first off is many individuals find themselves getting to where they have to do required minimum distributions, and they don't want the distribution. They're realizing, wow, we don't need this money that we're going to have to take out, and also is going to create taxable income. So one simple thing you can do to help solve that problem and do good in the world is do what is called qualified charitable distributions. So what is that? That's a direct transfer from your IRA custodian, the firm that you own your IRA at, to a qualified charity. And when you do that, that can be used to satisfy your required minimum distribution for the year. It will be excluded from your taxable income, so it won't impact Social Security taxability and Medicare and all that other stuff. It's not income. And then one nice thing about it is that it's not an itemized event. So you can avoid tax law restrictions on itemized charitable contributions because the deduction was raised not that long ago and the standard deduction is pretty high now. If you're single, you would need to have itemized deductions over $12,400 before you could itemize. And if you're married, it's double that, $24,800. When you do a qualified charitable distribution, it doesn't matter if you use the standard deduction. This happens before that. So that really helps out in controlling your taxable income and being able to take advantage of it. So it's pretty effective. Some of the advantages are it doesn't add to your adjusted gross income. It avoids having to itemize, satisfies your RMD. And one small thing that you might not think about, if you have a mix of pre-tax money and after-tax contributions in your IRA, if you do a qualified charitable deduction, when it pulls that money out, it's only going to draw from the pre-tax assets, which will mean that in subsequent years, if you take money out, your ratio of how much of that distribution is going to be taxable is going to increase for the non-taxable portion. So it's only going to pull out pre-tax assets, which I think is pretty cool. Some of the rules around doing a qualified charitable distribution, a QCD, as they say, is you got to be over 70 and a half. Now, I'm assuming it's 72. The maximum that you can qualify as a QCD is $100,000 to one or more charities. So you don't have to do it to just one charity. You could spread it out. You got to do it by the end of the year, just like you would have to do any RMD. It's going to have to be eligible accounts. They have to be qualified charities. So they got to be 501c3s. So they can't be private foundations or donor advised funds and things like that. But that's a very efficient way to give to charity. They're getting money tax-free because it's not going to be taxed to them when they receive the donation. You're satisfying your RMD. You're not having impact your adjusted gross income for all the other things that AGI is used to surcharge you for. So that's a good way of doing it. Another option while you're alive is donating appreciated assets. So when you have an asset, let's say you bought something let's say you bought 100 Amazon at $100 a share. So you put in $10,000 and now it's worth $2,800 a share, $280,000. Well, if you were to sell that, you would have a capital gain of $270,000. and you'd have to pay 20% of that, which would be about $54,000. And some people will do that. They'll sell something and then give money to charity. Well, you ended up paying this big capital gain. Instead, what you can do is donate all or whatever portion of the shares of Amazon to a qualified charity, and you're going to receive a deduction equal to the amount of the donation up to IRS limits. Obviously, you got to talk to your CPA. If you can do something like this, you want to get that right. The charity gets to receive the full value. You get a deduction for the value of the asset, and you don't have any capital gains, and you've given effectively more money to charity. And if you believe, let's say, Amazon is still a good investment and you really want to own it, but you also have this charitable intent, what you can do is give the Amazon that you have, get the full deduction, buy more Amazon, and restart your cost basis at, in this example, $2,800 a share. Sometimes we don't think of that because we want to give money to a charity and maybe you have a number of different appreciated assets, but you're like, oh no, I really want to hold on to Amazon in this example. So you go do something else. Well, this is a chance to restart your cost basis and do exactly what you wanted to do beforehand. So this is a good strategy. It can help you rebalance your portfolio from concentrated positions or overweights. So giving appreciated assets can really be a great way to give to charity and be tax effective or efficient. Well, what happens if you don't really have a charity picked out yet, but you would really like to give and you would really like that tax deduction? So there's something called a donor advised fund, a DAF. And a donor advised fund is a real simple way of having your own charity. And you can donate money, cash, or appreciated assets to the donor advised fund, which is essentially a commingled pool that is run by major investment firms. You get the tax deduction. And then that money is in the donor advised fund. And then annually, you can choose charities to give a portion or all of the assets to year after year. And the portion that isn't donated, you've already got the tax deduction, can be invested to grow over time. So essentially, you've created a very simple version of a private foundation. There's technical things around this, but the key here is you can give cash, or you can give an appreciated asset into the donor advised fund without having to make the decision of a charity. And now you have annually the ability, and there's some requirements around it, to pick a charity or charities to give a portion or all of the assets in that donor advised fund to. And you get the benefit of the tax deduction on the front end. Now, one elegant way I think a donor advised fund can be used, and I've seen it used, is creating, let's say you're a donor advised fund. You give, say, $100,000 to a donor advised fund. And then every year you decide you're going to give 5% of that to some charity. What you can do is, usually Christmas, Thanksgiving is a good time to do it, is make this very transparent with your family, and rather it be your donor advised fund, it's the family's donor advised fund. So you can involve your children and you can involve your grandchildren in choosing charities each year to give assets to. So you could set up a family meeting around a natural gathering time for family and allow members of the family to suggest a charity and maybe make a case for the charity, the cause, and the fact that they're efficient stewards of it. And then the family votes on it, or you could rotate. But it's a great way of getting all of the economic benefits that the tax code allows, but also allows you to model, but not just model, let them actually participate in the giving process, whether that's your children or your grandchildren. So I think that's a really cool way to use charitable giving while you're alive that can really live beyond you. And that's a way you change society, isn't it? The last ones I'm going to talk about as possible vehicles are more complicated and rarely used, but they're available to you. And those are using a trust in tandem with your charitable giving and still receiving benefit. And the two main trusts that you might consider are charitable remainder trusts and charitable lead trusts. Now, if you're going to do this, you're going to want to have a coordination with a CPA and attorney and think this through, because these are not unwound. Essentially what happens is, in a charitable remainder trust, let's use that one first. In a charitable remainder trust, it allows you to insert money into this trust and select you or another beneficiary to receive payments from the value of the assets that you've donated to the charity. And then at the end of your life, or the beneficiary's life, whatever the remainder is will go to the charity. So it's like creating an annuity with your own money, but you get the tax deduction up front. So if you put $1 million into a charitable remainder trust, you're not going to get the deduction for the whole $1 million because you're taking money from it. So there are tables in place where it gives you the value that ultimately will go to the charity based on the terms of the trust, and that will be the amount of your deduction. So as an example, you give $1 million, you get guaranteed payments to you for the rest of your life, and based on the table, it says really only $600,000 of that is a charitable deduction because that's the present value of the gift that ultimately will go to the charity. So you can see how these would be a little complicated. But the advantages of it are you get a deduction up front, and you've created your own annuity to yourself, in effect, own payments to yourself, and you've helped the charity. Now, a charitable lead trust is the opposite. Charitable lead trust allows you to make a donation and then make payments to the charity during your lifetime, and the remainder of the assets go to you, your spouse, or your beneficiaries. Or even a shorter term than at death. These are more complicated things, but they're things that you can throw into your quiver as you're evaluating this based on the complexity of your life. Now let's talk about how you can give in estate after your death. Well, the simplest way, and we're really only going to talk about two just from time's sake. The simplest way is just bequest in your will. It's very simple and direct. In your will, you say, I want to give $100,000 to XYZ charity. And then what will happen is the value of that $100,000 will be in your estate, and the charitable deduction for the gift will equal it out. So that money essentially goes to the charity at your death. Another example would be naming a beneficiary of an IRA as a charity. In this instance, neither you or your heirs or your estate are going to pay taxes on that IRA asset. Your estate will include the value of the IRA in the estate tax return or the gross estate, but you're going to receive a deduction for the charitable contribution. The charity is going to get the IRA asset, pay no income tax, and the full amount of the IRA will go directly to the charity. And you can divide that between different charities, or you could have half going to the charity, half going to an heir or a child or so. And it helps in a couple ways, because maybe you have other assets that you want to give to your family that are after-tax assets. Well, those assets, if they go to a family, they'll be included in your estate. The family will receive a stepped-up cost basis, meaning that the value that they receive is going to be their tax cost basis. So if we go back to that Amazon example early, if you have 100 shares of Amazon at $28 a share and you pay 10 for it, the value of that asset, the $280,000, is going to be part of your estate. But when your, say, child receives that, because it's after-tax assets, their new cost basis will be $2,800 a share. So they'll only pay tax if they ever sell it on gains from that point forward. Whereas with an IRA, if you give it to a child, say, they're going to have to start taking required minimum distributions. And with the new laws, it's going to have to happen within 10 years. And they're going to have to pay taxes on that like it was income. So giving to a charity as part of your IRA can have some benefits. So hopefully this helped you think about charitable giving. Next week, we're going to talk about organization and communication of your wishes and your assets so you can give the gift of organization to your family. And that may be the biggest gift of all. But right now, we're going to go talk to Peter Lazaroff and answer some of your listener questions. Now it's time for the question and answer session. And as Nicole is still raising her new human, Dawson, who is in the world, he's an adorable kid, by the way. With her permission, we'll maybe share some pictures of that. But she is not joining us, so I have another one of my good friends, and he is a friend of the show. You've been on the show before, Peter. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm great, Roger. It's really good to see you. I feel like we communicate a lot, but I don't always get to see your face. So.
Yeah, we're on Zoom here. You don't know that, but...
this is true, yes.
Yeah. And Peter's a pretty good-looking guy, so I don't mind looking at him.
Oh.
But Peter is the Chief Investment Officer of Plan Corp and author of the book Making Money Simple, which we talked about when it came out.
Mm-hmm.
And he's wicked smart. He's, who do you write for?
So I do regular contributions at the Wall Street Journal and at Forbes.
There you go.
Almost, I think, monthly hit both spots, as long as I have time.
Well, he's an interesting dude. So Peter's going to help me with questions today. And so before we get to the questions, Peter, this month that we're talking about from a theme perspective is estate planning. Very exciting. How did you get over the dryness and the need to get your estate plan done? Because it's not something, it's always important, but it's never urgent.
For me personally, it was when my wife was pregnant with our first child. And I do remember we had a company benefit where the company would pay for half of your basic estate planning documents. That was a pretty nice benefit. I never heard anybody else do that. And getting estate planning documents, good ones, it's not astronomically expensive. I mean, you can go hire a really fancy lawyer and spend a ton on some basic documents, but even basic documents will range between $1,200 to $2,500. And having a child is what triggered it for me. And if you ask 10 different estate planning attorneys when's the right time to get your estate plan, they'll all have different answers. Some will be asset level, some will be life event, owning a home, getting married, having a kid, having $1 million. But for me, it was having the kid. And I think we needed to have guardians for our kids. I think having our assets titled correctly so that future generations, if something terrible happened to us, it's giving you control over your health, over your money, over your children when you're unable to make those decisions. And so that was what sort of got me to do it. But I understand it's not super interesting and it's not always fun to think about.
Well, let's use an example. You talked about, and I think you're right. And I think retirement should be one of those triggers to evaluate this. But for you, usually there is a trigger. Like for you, it was the birth of your child or pending birth of your child. And so you realize it. So that's the motivator. And then you go get the document and everything else. A lot of times things bog down in answering all the questions that you need to answer. Like let's take the example of, okay, if both of us die in a car wreck, who raises our child? Well, that can be a little conflict there and cause it just to sort of be put away. Well, I don't want your sister to do it. My brother should do it and all those things. How do you get through those? Because they're weird decisions to even try to contemplate.
They are. And I think when you have a third party involved, it helps. So, you and I are both advisors, and so we're naturally biased in what I'm going to say, but having someone who's nudging you forward, someone who is professionally guiding you along, trying to nudge you with, that always makes a difference. I think that the more you can have these conversations, there are tools and worksheets that can be helpful in thinking about this. And sometimes even talking when it comes down to guardians or healthcare power of attorneys, you're talking to the people. Don't just make it a survey that you're filling out. Go and talk to the individuals, let them know because they may not be comfortable taking your children or making your healthcare decisions or making your financial decisions. And we typically see people reach retirement and a lot has changed since their first set of documents or maybe even their second set because their kids are older, their friends have changed, maybe they're living in a different area. A lot changes throughout life, and a trust, a will, these power of attorneys, they're supposed to be living, breathing documents that can be updated over time. Not at no cost, attorney fees apply, but ultimately I think working through these conversations, yes, people want to avoid the idea that something unfortunate will happen to them, but we all are going to eventually pass. And even if that's the mindset you have to get into, let's assume there is no disaster between now and a nice long life. You still have to have those decisions and you want to make it easy for the people that you love that are going to benefit from whatever it is that you leave behind.
Well said. Well said. Well, let's get on to some listener questions. And our first question comes from Rick on Roth conversions and taxes. So he presently contributes to a Roth IRA and plans to convert some money from a traditional IRA to a Roth. And his question is, will the money that he converts cause his income to go over the limit to be able to contribute to your Roth IRA? And I'm going to take this one, Peter, because this is the easy one. And then I'm going to let you have the follow-up. So when you're converting a Roth, you're taking pre-tax IRA assets and converting it to a Roth. It doesn't matter how much you do. It's not going to impact your ability to make your normal Roth contribution, assuming that your normal income is below whatever the levels are at the time. I don't have the figures here in front of me. So you can convert all day long and it's not going to prohibit you from being able to convert to a Roth IRA. So his follow-up question, Peter, for extra credit is, will his conversion count as income when he applies for Medicare in terms of IRMA and causing his Medicare premiums to go up? Do you know the answer?
The answer to this is yes, because income is income. And the moment you've done this conversion, the government, they want to collect everything they've been owed. I think Roger and I and some others usually joke that you owe your full tax bill, but you don't want to leave a tip. And so this Roth conversion is a manner in which you can strategically do that to minimize the amount you're going to owe on taxes. However, yes, it does count towards your taxable income in that year. And it also can push you into a higher bracket. It can change your healthcare costs if you have Medicare premiums. And so I think it's one of the common mistakes people make is not being aware of not just which income bracket they're in, but how it impacts their other government benefits.
So if you do a big Roth conversion and you're either currently on Medicare, it could impact IRMA, that surcharge.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Absolutely. And I think that it's interesting. I know, Roger, you have some content out there on this and you've done podcasts on it, and I've put content out on it. And it's usually a question that I get from readers after the fact saying, hey, I did this last year, but this happened. And you say, yeah, that's one of the reasons you got to be really careful. A tax projection can help. An advisor can help you do that. A CPA can do it for a one-time fee, usually. It's really just a matter of trying to make sure you convert little amounts in those low-income years so that by the time you get to your RMD age, that you've minimized the RMD while not bumping up your tax bracket leading up to that and realizing some of these IRMA limits.
And another thing you can do, and I think a friend of the show made this comment when we've talked about IRMA before, is you can actually write to the government and say, hey, this was an extraordinary thing, so it doesn't carry over to the next year.
Right.
Our next question comes from Jeremy, and I don't answer these kind of questions a lot on the show, but I thought we would. And I actually find this a lot with people later in life. Now, Jeremy's 42, but I find this even with 50, 60-year-olds, and I'm quasi-mentoring a few right now, that want to become a financial planner or an advisor. That's a difficult business to get into and make a living initially. And it's also a difficult business to get into and have it and manage the regulatory parts of that. And he's gone through Dave Ramsey's Peace University program, and he's just naturally predicated to this. And that's probably why he listens to a show like this. What advice would you have for someone who wants to become an advisor, say later in life?
Well, I think one thing to recognize is that going it alone will be a lot of work. You may have all of the expertise in the world, but people trusting you with their money I mean, next to health and family, that's the hardest thing to gather someone's trust over. And so I would say that if you want to go that route, you're better off going to an established firm that you can kind of point to the deep bench. That isn't true necessarily forever, but mid-career, if you want to get moving quickly, people will say, well, what do you know about this topic? Even if you have been doing these courses, that would probably be one piece. I'm a really big fan of the CFP designation, Certified Financial Planner. I wish that it was the industry standard, just like CPAs are the industry standard for accounting work. That's not the case. However, you're likely to learn all of the different things that you could see when you're helping an individual or their families. And you may not be an expert in all of them, but you should know enough to recognize the flags. So I think those are probably the two core pieces of information I would advise anybody coming into the profession, whether it's late in life, early in life, or midway through your career. And just like any other place, I think a lot of hard work is to be expected. There are some financial advisors I remember watching growing up where it looked like all they did was play golf and go on vacation and work from the mountains. What you didn't see, that's like the tip of the iceberg. You see the top, but you don't see all the work that went on underneath, the people who really grind hard to build relationships. And that'd be the final thing is if you don't naturally love building relationships with people, this might not be the best profession, because while there's a lot of technical pieces involved, ultimately it's being able to understand a human's key pain points and issues and being help them through things that are often more than financials. I mean, we were talking about estate planning. How do you get through some of these pain points when you can't agree? There is no spreadsheet in the world that's going to solve that problem. And so it does take a unique set of skills to perform and to be successful. I'd be curious to hear what you think, Roger, as well.
Go work at Lowe's. It's a lot easier. No, seriously. And he goes on to say, Jeremy talks about he's a certified in financial coaching through Ramsey Solutions, Dave Ramsey's organizations. Mm-hmm. And he's worked one-on-one with about 12 or 15 individuals. And so it sounds like it's just moving towards that. I agree with that. I mean, I think back to how I got into this business, and I would never want to have to go through that again. And I think this is the really hard part with our industry as a whole, whether you're a consumer of financial advice or someone who wants to be a provider of it, is its root is still embedded in sales.
Right.
And financial institutions actually are really attracted to later life candidates because they have friends, they have networks, and they look the part, and I'm being a little jaded here, and see them as a way of bringing more clients into the institution because of that network, whereas the 22-year-old competent CFP knows a bunch of 22-year-olds. And so that's part of the mindset behind the financial institution. So I would question Jeremy, rather than figure it out, you're doing financial coaching, and there's this weird line between there. You look at Dave Ramsey. We'll use him as an example since you're familiar with him. And love him or hate him aside, people like Dave Ramsey or Dan Miller, who I'm friends with, or others, they started table to table. I mean, Dave Ramsey, when he started, and he's talked about it, across the kitchen table, just coaching people, and then slowly built up. And he had, I imagine, a pivot point of, wow, I'm financially coaching people. The natural progression seems to be becoming an advisor, becoming a financial planner, etc. And I'm not going to speak today, but this is my impression, and from what I understand of him, is I'm guessing the choice came down to, well, if I do that, I become the industry, I become regulated, and I'm going to have to navigate things that may cause me not to be able to talk the way I want to talk and serve the way I want to serve. So he made the choice, in my estimation, I'm going to be a financial coach and create products and content that empower people, but never cross the line to advising. And I would argue that he's changed millions of lives, many for the better. Love him or hate him. So I think first ask, what is the purpose of becoming an advisor or pursuing this? If it's to give specific financial advice and manage portfolios and et cetera, get your CFP, and then start to look for, I would say registered investment advisory firms, not the big institutions, and find a firm that can help mentor you up and give you the experience that you'll need for the certification anyway. And then, but don't think that this is how you're going to be able to make a living anytime soon. Now, a really good example, Peter, I have in Jeremy is I have a lady who works for me as a research assistant who's a biostatistician. And she loves that job, but she loves financial planning and she wants to at some point transition in. So she works for me part-time as a research assistant to gain experience for her CFP and to get some mentoring from me. So I think that might be a good way to navigate it.
Well, in your point of a registered investment advisor, there are big ones, there are small ones. I would say that if you're talking to them, the emphasis should be more on that coaching and mentorship than how many sales will you make by what amount of time. And we have a relatively large firm and we have someone who's a former banker and you'd think it'd be a natural fit. But yet it was the social worker who joined us who accelerated faster because of her ability to connect with people. And I think that's a big piece that you can't learn in a textbook. And you made a great point about coaching versus giving advice. If the goal is not to give investment advice or hard advice, there's so much technology that you can be a great coach and help people and then point them towards technology type products to fill in that extra little gap.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. And I think because most of the people I found, XY Planning Network is also a good place you can go look for people that are starting very lean. And I remember going to the XY Planning, and this is a financial planning network for very young people. Yeah, that's probably too broad.
Very young, huh? Yeah, very.
To an old guy like me. But 20 and 30-year-old people that are getting into the business and starting very solopreneur type operations. And I went there, and what I found was they were extremely passionate about serving. They were very competent. A lot of them came out of master's programs for CFP at Texas Tech and other universities. And very few of them had any career path in the business other than the old model. Okay, you're an advisor, go bring in clients, which is basically go sell yourself. There weren't W-2 models or mentorship models. And the older generation are dying for really, really quality people just to help and be mentored and not have to go sell. The really good firms don't need to go sell.
Well, and as you mentioned, Jeremy, the person asking the question, is in his 40s. The average CFP holder is over the age of 60 right now. And the baby boomer generation is the primary group who needs advisors. There's a mismatch. You're entering the wealth management industry in your late 50s or early 60s, and you're sitting across the table from somebody who wants guidance throughout their entire retirement. They know you're not going to be there. If you're in your 40s, you're likely going to see them through their whole retirement, which I think is an advantage at this point. People in their 20s and 30s have the same advantage, but I don't think it's too late to get in. And it's a wonderful profession. It's very rewarding. You get to help people. You make a real impact on their lives. The work-life balance is great, unless you're a workaholic, in which you're just self-inflicting pain. But it's really, I feel so fortunate to have come into this profession. I think I came in for different reasons and I've stayed for different reasons. I just think it's a wonderful, wonderful life path. And so if you're passionate about it, I hope nothing we've said is discouraging and only encouraging of how great a path it can be.
Well said. Well said. Okay, now we'll get to some specifics here. Okay, we're going to get back to the technical side. You ready, Peter?
Yes.
So I'm going to paraphrase this question. And I'm amazed, by the way, the questions that we get that are so full of detail, the technical part and the softer part to give context. And I read all of them. Some of them are paragraphs. So this one I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. This person, she has substantial assets, $1 million IRA, $1 million brokerage account, a lot of cash in Roth and so forth. And has a lot of long-term incentive stock options in her company that literally the stock goes up once or down $1 or down $1. It's $45,000 difference using their math. And so you can imagine from before pandemic, during pandemic, and after pandemic, even though she has all these substantial diversified assets in other places, she wants to know, how does she navigate the specific stock risk of a substantial amount of money worth of over $1 million within the plan. And also having to factor in there, with stock options, just so you know, usually when you work for a company and the company will grant you stock options, which gives you the right to buy their company stock at a certain price and it expires. And usually these are the vesting schedules. So you can't execute on that option quickly. So she has to deal with some of it she has access to, some of it she doesn't. It's all tied up with this one company. And she wanted some ideas of how to manage this risk. Did I paraphrase that well enough, Peter?
Yeah. It's actually one of my most favorite topics, which is effectively individual stock holdings as well as concentrated in your company. And it sounds like this person is retired. So one of the common threads when you're working is you feel like you have some knowledge about the company, and what research shows that tends to give you a false sense of confidence and understanding and control over its future. But let's start with one key piece when you're talking about any individual stock, and particularly when it's stock that you've received or options or RSUs or any sort of deferred kind of non-traditional comp, is this is compensation. So I like to treat these options as compensation. And when I'm eligible to sell them, I believe in diversifying out of them, because if you were paid in cash, would you go and buy these options? That's, kind of the first starting point. If you had the same amount of money in cash today, would you trade it in for those options? Most people would say no, I would take the cash. And people struggle to sell options because there's a tax bill. They struggle to part with the idea that they're giving up upside. But consider the fact that 40% of all companies suffer a catastrophic loss of 70% or more and never come back. And there's a client I have in mind who works for Boeing. And last year we were looking at his 401k plan, and he had 100% of his 401k in Boeing stock. And he's never done that before. We've always said, don't do that. So you really shouldn't do that. We actually try to limit individual company exposure to 10% or less. And I would love to get it down to 5% for most people. And he said, well, I'm working on the front lines. We have a big backlog of orders. It's all going to be okay. Well, and when all these, I can't remember if it was the 737s or the 747s, when they all got grounded, and we checked to make sure he had made that change, he still hadn't made that change. And now he's not retired. He was supposed to retire this year. And so that's a real risk, and so you mentioned the options, I think you said were worth over $1 million, and they go up and down $45,000 in value per every $1 change. If your company were to experience a catastrophic loss, you're not getting that wealth back. And I think the research, about once a year, I write an article on individual stock exposure. And sometimes it's tied to company compensation behind that. And sometimes it's just generally to become wealthy. The wealthiest people in the world, you look at Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett. Well, they had all their wealth concentrated in one stock, and they hit it big. And the only way where you're going to really change your life, truly change the way that you live your day-to-day life, is by putting an unreasonable amount of your net worth into a single stock. I mean, if I go and buy some single stock today, I'm not going to put 50% of my net worth into it. I think we'd all agree that's a little scary. But when you're compensated that way, it's hard to make that sort of mental connection. And so, in my opinion, taxes will be an issue, no doubt. And so all else equal, this is kind of an all else equal thought, I would look to diversify out of that position. It sounds like it makes up a pretty sizable part of the balance sheet. And if it was designed to be compensation, treat it as compensation. And that first question I asked, if you had that money in cash today, would you buy the same position, the same options? My guess is the answer is no. So it's really something that's, I think, difficult to realize, but ultimately probably makes the most sense to diversify over time.
This really goes well with our topic of the entire last month, which is behavioral management and cognitive biases that we have based on how things are framed. And I think the way you frame it, Peter, is very important. Is this is meant as compensation. This is like your paycheck that you can defer for some of it, but you're basically going to have to pay taxes on it. And I've told the story probably, in my mind, I feel like I've told the story way too many times, but probably not, because I guess I'll be told if I did.
It keeps happening, so they need to keep hearing it. Yeah.
Well, I remember in the late 90s, I went through this with a number of clients with a technology company. And the extremes were much broader than this. And on paper, I had two clients that looked almost identical. Pre-bubble, worth a couple $100,000, middle age, got lots of stock options in their company. boom happens. They go from a couple 100,000 net worth to, on paper, 30 plus million net worth, like that, literally within 6 months. And these were a mix of stock options, non-qualified, and incentive stock options, what they don't really do anymore. And so the question was, all this newfound wealth, what do we do? Well, if you just, and a lot of these were already vested, by the way. Do we sell them and pay this astronomical tax bill because it's considered taxable income? Because what, Peter? It is income.
Yes, yes.
Or do we develop this nuanced strategy to manage tax rates, blah, blah, blah? And then you had the added wrinkle of incentive stock options where you can exercise and buy the stock, not sell it, and hold on to it for a year and then get long-term capital gains treatment, which is attractive. That's, in this case, millions of dollars in some cases. And so the question always, what do we need to take care of the rest of your life? Right? And one client, I think the number was $4 million at the time. So it's like, okay, well, let's get net $4 million out of the incentive stock options. I was younger at this time, Peter, and not as wise as you are. So I was trying to be nuanced because it was a new economy. So of course it was going to go up.
Yes.
And so they agreed to that, but they wanted to do it over 4 or 5 years, 3 or 4 years to tranche it out. The other client started having dreams of private jets, being Jeff Bezos, even though he wasn't around then. And so they wanted to exercise, hold, and then do capital gains treatment on a large amount of money. And I totally disagreed with that. Well, long story short, this is probably within the span of 18 to 24 months, the stock blew up. Client 1 didn't get out their whole $4 million, but they did get out a decent amount of money. But client 2 had a lot of stock that they exercised the option. So they had to pay all the money. They had to pay for that stock that now was worth substantially less money than what they paid for it. And they still had the tax bill. Long story short is you got to remember what the money's about. And I think that's the hard part here. So I would agree with Peter on this. And what do you do with the vested options? I mean, yeah, you could buy puts on it and do some other things to try to mitigate some of that risk. But think about what you need to accomplish your life. And if this is what the purpose of this money is, because that's really going to help define your strategy set. Good questions. I love the technical questions. Peter, thanks so much for joining us, man.
It's always my pleasure. Anytime.
You read his articles in Wall Street Journal and in Forbes. Peter Lazaroff. Now let's go to the SMART Sprint.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to set a little baby step that you can take in the next 7 days to, rock retirement and life. So in the next 7 days, you know where we're going here. Examine your charitable giving, whether it's through volunteerism or through money. And see if there's an opportunity to do some long-term planning or just do some short-term planning right now. This is something, I'm going to be honest with you, that I struggle with. That I don't feel this area of my life is that great. I mean, I've given to charity. I gave to the Pelotonia last year. It's haphazard. I don't volunteer anywhere. And I feel it's one of those things I haven't taken action on because I feel so busy doing the podcast and doing everything else. And in some ways, maybe I fool myself. That's a way of giving to others. Hopefully this gives you good. But it's an area that I feel inadequate in. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But it's a good time this next week to examine that for yourself. The one thing I always forget to do, which I'm doing now, is ask you to ask me. Do you have a question about estate planning, about retirement, about the financials, about the softer side of things? We want to answer your questions on the show and hopefully help you on your journey. And you can ask those questions at rogerwhitney.com/Ask Roger, and I would love to hear from you. Have a great day. Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize this is helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.